What's up, everybody? So, one of the defining features of the pre-heresy period in 40K's timeline is the philosophy that guides the fledgling Imperium, because it's completely opposite what we see the Imperium become in the 41st millennium. And I'm, of course, talking about the Imperial Truth. So I just want to do a bit of a breakdown of what the Imperial Truth kind of is and what it represents, the pitfall, the major pitfall with it in the form of the warp, and how you can still kind of have the Imperial Truth work with that. And then my thoughts on the Imperial Truth in general, why I feel like we can see its form of progression actually be a thing during its short time in comparison to the 10 millennium of post-heresy God Emperor worship, and just basically go on down rambling about the Imperial Truth a bit. So let's have some fun with it. Share your thoughts in the comment section below. So the Imperial Truth is basically, the best way to put it is it's the idea of reason, science, rational thought, technological progression, and capability. It does not believe in stagnation. Doesn't believe in, not that it's not oppressive, but doesn't believe in the crippling oppression of fear worship, worshiping something out of fear, or being very believing in the supernatural and superstitions. It believes in basically calculated ways of looking at things. You can perceive the galaxy, the threats in the galaxy, and all the crazy realms of stuff rationally, and deduce what it is and break it down and have an understanding enough to combat it or just to deal with it or whatever the case might be. Very different from the Imperium in the 41st millennium. So even with dealing with Xenos and Psychers, other mutants, even other realms, with this rational thought process, you can make sense of it. Those Xenos aren't spirits or witches, or, you're not a wizard, nothing like that. It's all very much an understandable phenomenon rationally. And this comes directly from the Emperor's mind. It's basically how he operates and how he's operated with all of his projects and the like, and it's how he's guiding humanity during the Great Crusade to reunite them across the stars, whether it's willingly by the planets or through bloodshed and conquest. Uniting humanity in this Imperium with the Imperial Truth was a very strong binding guiding light with real progression going on. So with that said, it's in many ways the exact opposite way of thinking from the warp and chaos. Chaos needs worship to be empowered. It needs sacrifices. It needs a way to project itself into the material realm. And the Emperor's thought process is the very opposite of it. But with that said, there is basically one major commandment, if you will, if you want to use that term, of the Imperial Truth, and that is to not make artificial intelligence. The men of iron, the thinking machines of old, are responsible for bringing about the old night, the age of strife, and all that. So they're a big contributing factor. So artificial intelligence is not part of that rational thought and progression. It's too dangerous. And that's really it. I mean, the idea of humanity is very xenophobic in general, and disdains non-humans in 40K. So the idea of just the purity of the human genes and not to try and breed with non-humans is not really, it's kind of that unspoken, well, obviously type of rule thing. But really the big one is no artificial intelligence. So with that said, the warp is a major pitfall. The Emperor, for all his understanding of it and capability, and being the anti of the warp, being the big enemy of the Chaos Gods, ultimately his failing is in not educating enough on the dangers of the warp and kind of just leaving it in ignorance. Ignorance can be a shield against things, but in this case with the warp, it was the Emperor, in my opinion, and in the way the fluff has it look, goes too far in keeping humanity in the dark about the warp. And during the Great Crusade, where multiple legions and other forces have come in contact with warp entities, warp corruption, something with the warp going on, they basically have to fend for themselves without a real explanation of what it is, try and kind of figure out what they can do on their own. and come come through it, but ultimately probably with heavier casualties or more confusion than if they were properly taught by the emperor. The emperor really went through and discussed it. And this is why the warp is considered the great lie of the Imperial Truth, because the warp surely is supernatural in its ways, with malicious spirits and demonic entities and the chaos gods. And that, to the emperor, is probably a falsehood as well. You probably view it as just a really powerful, radically different Xenos group, if you want to think about it that way. Now, clearly, the chaos gods are set up to be in that supernatural spectrum, but the immaterium and the material, those two different realms, operate with very different rule sets on them. So to think about and try and force our rule set into making sense of the immaterium just isn't going to work, and therefore you would fall back on, well, it's supernatural. But if you understand that its realm operates on vastly different rule sets, you can kind of make sense of it in a certain capacity and not really view it as some supernatural entity. And that is probably the very thing the Chaos Gods despise about the Emperor. Because worship and acts done in their name do tend to strengthen the Chaos Gods and their reach into the material realm to a degree. So you can rationalize the warp and warp travel as if it's kind of like the oceans to land of Earth, right? The monstrous squids and scary sharks will die on land, while the demons, without being in possession of a body or in a warp storm, will die not die, but they'll pop and fizzle out in the material realm. So there's some correlations you could draw, and there's ways you can rationalize it. But the Emperor doesn't even attempt to do that. The Emperor keeps the Imperium in ignorance of the warp until it's basically too late. And it's probably out of an attempt to protect humanity. And if it wasn't for the heresy, it probably would have worked. The Emperor is very long-term in his goals. So he probably had a goal in mind for warp knowledge and protection against it. And at some point after the Great Crusade, he would have probably did that. We kind of get a little bit of a glimpse of this with the Council of Nicaea, with the librarians of the Space Marine Legions and being told to disband, and that basically it's not time for this yet. This will be addressed following the Great Crusade. So he probably had a plan, and we just never got to see it happen. But because of psychers and astropaths and navigators all can see through the material realm and have some type of understanding in terms of warp and how the warp entities feed on human souls and souls in general, it's called a great lie, because there are more than just the Emperor that can see into that realm and understand that realm to a point. Not as good as the Emperor does. And with that understanding or with that knowledge, you kind of look at the Imperial Truth and go, well, how can I possibly rationalize this? This just doesn't fit into our rules, so it can't be rational. And I already mentioned how you just got to look at it with the rule set, the defining features of the warp, right? But the Emperor's mind is so above humanity that it would be like, if you don't study a particular field of anything and you hear two experts in said field discussing something, and you're listening along and you know nothing about that field, or you just have no real knowledge of that field, any real working knowledge of it, you're going to feel very lost in their conversation, because it's going to be way over your head, especially using all of the expert nomenclature and whatnot. So that is what it would be like for the Emperor to try and rationalize it to somebody explaining the warp, and that's probably why he thought it's better off for his safety for them not to even be tempted to learn it, right? Because if they learn about these warp entities and the false promises they bring in their attempt to make an understanding of it, they will make themselves known to the warp. So the warp could then trick them, and it wouldn't be good. So that's probably why he chose ignorance as the tactic for that time. It's just unfortunate the heresy happens. We don't get to see what his next step was going to be for dealing with the warp with his Astartes and just in general, given the rise of psychers and the like. Because Psychers is something that the Imperial Truth can explain away naturally. It's a mutation. It's a genetic mutation that allows the human mind to tap into the warp energy, channel it, and use it to do unnatural stuff in this, or things perceived as unnatural, such as shooting fireballs out of your hand or using telekinesis in the material world. So that right there even has some rationale. So it's through that concept of rationalization of all workings of the galaxy as you know it that you come across that great lie wall, if you will, of the warp. And that probably would have been addressed should the heresy have not happened and the Emperor stayed alive and well. Anyways, with that said, the Great Crusade was fueled by the Imperial Truth. Like I said, it was the Imperial Truth probably had a few centuries at most of being the law of the land. In those few centuries, we saw real technological development and progress, not the stagnation we know of in the Imperium in the 41st millennium. Weaponry, one example is you had the Reaper autocannon. From there, you got the rotary cannon, which would become the assault cannon that the Loyalist Terminators use. Progression through the Crusade. We have Mark II powered armor, the first true powered armor, because Mark I was semi-powered armor, created for the purpose of the Great Crusade. And then they didn't just rest in their high horses there. Mark III was created to offer extra frontal protection and offer some improvements. Mark IV was an all-around improvement to powered armor and technology. What would become Mark VI, a further improvement still. Mark V is heresy armor, and that is just a catch-all term for all the different variants of armor kind of produced or rebuilt using the salvage materials during the heresy, because supplies were at a low and all chaotic in terms of getting your supply lines and all that, so won't count Mark V for this. And Mark VII was even in design during the final stages of the Horus Heresy. All of this in a few centuries total. Less than 100 years per mark, when you think about it, of technological progression just in the realm of powered armor. And then we saw the assault cannon eventually come out of the rotary cannon, which was meant to replace the auto cannon. So we see progression there in a short period of time. Those are just a couple of examples, and there's others out there. Another example is that I'll do real quick is the Thunderhawk. We know the Thunderhawk from 40K, 41st Millennium stuff. It was designed at the late stages of the Great Crusade to replace the Stormbird. And that hasn't been replaced in over 10,000 years. So we see progression there. Post-heresy, there is progression, but it's not just straight up innovation. Most of it is rediscovering an old standard template construct to give them access to an old blueprint, if you will, and thus a relic of the golden age of the past. But I do have some developments outside of that, and we see really the best example is Primaris. Call and Gulliman bringing their Primaris project to full proof, if you will, to actually finish it and have it go active, which was something that took, for different reasons, the full 10,000 years. Not that it took 10,000 years for Cole to do it, but he kind of kept it in stasis and on the wraps and whatnot and monitoring and whatever. But we don't see that concentration of progress and improvement with Imperial technology in those 10,000 years like we see in the Great Crusade with the Imperial Truth. Like I said, only a few centuries, but yet a lot of progression made, and then you have 10,000 years and really not so much. So yes, they're just examples of powered armor and stuff for Space Marines. I get that, but those are the easy examples to pull forth from the fluff and the easiest ones to physically see. So I feel like they are worthwhile examples, and do showcase the Imperial Truth's idea of progression over stagnation. So outside of that, the idea of worshiping gods is also forbidden in the Imperial Truth. Because it's not rational thought. You don't need to worship something that basically the way the Emperor views it is not tangible. It doesn't exist, or whatever the case might be. So as a result, the ecclesiarchy is a huge problem for the Imperial Truth. And when we see the rise of the ecclesiarchy, we saw the fall of the Imperial Truth fully. And it's so ingrained in Imperial society in the 41st millennium, if they found the doctrine of the Imperial Truth and read it, it would come across as heretical dogma. Even though Custodes follow it, basically, and Gulliman believes in it still, and Space Marines operate to a certain extent. Most chapters operate in some capacity of the Imperial Truth to a certain extent. I wasn't sure if I was even saying the sentence right, but I was. So you have that going on kind of right beneath their noses, but if they just picked up a pamphlet of the Imperial Truth, it would be burnt as heretical material. So we're not going to see the Imperial Truth necessarily come back anytime soon, but what we are probably going to see is aspects of it kind of worm its way into the Imperium societal ways and just the ways of the Imperium in general. With Gulliman being a Primarch, being the Lord Regent of Terra, or of the Imperium, I should say, not just Terra. You're probably going to see some Imperial Truth dogma, if you will, worm its way in some capacity to better humanity, while under the guise of what it is. The more loyalist Primarchs that return, because there's rumors that we might get Lionel Johnson. It's like the third time we heard this rumor for this Primarch, but should it be him or another one that's a loyalist, we're gonna just have more concentrated Imperial Truth remembering going on here, and then more of a potential that the Imperial Truth or aspects of the Imperial Truth could make its way into the Imperial society, which could ultimately help it survive through its latest and greatest peril in 8th edition, but only time will tell there. If Gulliman or whatever other Primarch, or the two of them, whatever one comes, if there is one coming, decided to just go forth and institute the Imperial Truth, it would basically result in an immediate civil war. Because the ecclesiarchy would have to go bye-bye, and the ecclesiarchy is very comfortable and corrupt in the seat of power. So it may offer something, comfort for humanity, but it's definitely a corrupt group. One thing of the Imperium in the 41st millennium is kind of corrupt in general, but or corrupted in general. So that would result in not only them, but then the Sisters of Battle would have to be dealt with as well. So that would be almost an immediate civil war in its entirety, and it would be a war that would be done out of the best intentions for humanity, but would probably ultimately seal humanity's fate, because they would have a very climactic battle between themselves, humans, and then Chaos and Xenos would just pick them apart, and so it would not be feasible to really have that happen. So we're probably never going to see the Imperial Truth rise again unless we see something happen with the Emperor on the Golden Throne, and that's a topic for another time. Anyways, that's it for some basic ideas and tangents and ramblings on the Imperial Truth. Share your thoughts on the Imperial Truth. Hit that subscribe button to be part of future conversations such as this. And if you have any generic questions or anything like that, you go to the community tab of this channel and post it there. So anyways, that's it. Thanks very much for sticking through it. And until next time, take it easy.